Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation Food Safety and Organic webinar. We are delighted to have speakers from the Community Alliance of Family Farmers and Wild Farm Alliance with us today for the third installment of our Food Safety Modernization Act webinar series for organic agricultural professionals. In today's webinar, our speakers will review FSMA requirements, particularly of interest to organic growers, including manure, compost, animals, and water requirements. And just a note, today's webinar is supported through a USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Western SARE grant. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan and I will be your host today. I am a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. My colleague Jacob Guth will also be online with us today. Jacob is CCOF's Food Safety Program Manager. Prior to his current role, he worked in CCOF's Organic Certification Department for many years, and he'll be online to answer questions related to organic certification and third-party food safety audits. Before we get started with the presentations, I wanted to review a couple of housekeeping items. We're happy to announce that this live webinar broadcast has been approved for Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Units, as well as CCOF Inspector Continuing Education Units. To receive credit for attending the webinar, include your full name and CCA certification number, if relevant, in the evaluation form at the end of the webinar. You must attend the entire webinar to receive credit. I also wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of two parts. The viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will share on their screen, and the control panel on the right. Within that control panel is how you can participate in today's event, so let's look at that. By clicking the orange arrow, you can open and close the control panel. From the View menu, you can set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to always keep it open. The audio pane provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio via telephone by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed. During the presentation, you can send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email with a link to view a recording of today's event along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. So we'd like to encourage you to test out the questions pane. Write in, let us know where you're calling in from today and whether you've attended any of the other webinars in this series. And just to let you know, today's webinar will build off information that was presented in those previous webinars. So if you haven't checked them out, there are links on the CCOF website and you can take a look at them after the webinar. We will also be hosting a webinar similar to the FSMA 101 webinar on January 22nd. So I also wanted to note that we're covering 3 rather meaty topics in our presentations today with lots of details and really great information. And we also have a really good crowd out in the audience today. So I just wanted to say that we're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as possible. But if we don't get to your specific question, all of our speakers are open to having you follow up with them individually after the webinar. So if we don't get to your particular question, please take advantage of that and follow up after the webinar broadcast. So thanks again for being here today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters. They're going to be kind of handing the presentation off back and forth, so we'll introduce them all at the beginning. We have Dave Runston and Kaylee Feiereisel from Community Alliance of Family Farmers, Kaylee serves as CAFF's food safety specialist. She provides food safety technical assistance to farmers as they further develop practices to meet new requirements. And Dave serves as CAFF's policy director. He directs CAFF's policy work as well as food safety and water stewardship outreach. And we also have Joanne Baumgartner, the executive director of Wild Farm Alliance. She has authored many publications on the co-management of food safety and conservation. And she was also an organic farmer for over a decade, so brings lots of boots on the ground experience to her work. So Kaylee and Dave, you're starting off first, so I'll hand the presentation over to you, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Megan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Excuse me, I apologize. Dave and I are both a little under the weather today, so hopefully our coughs stay in control during this presentation. So I just wanted to do a couple slides initially here to, well, first our acknowledgement and disclaimer that this is funded under USDA NIFA Western Sahara grants, so we thank them for the opportunity to provide you this opportunity. And then, as Megan mentioned, there were 2 webinars earlier in this season, or in this series, and the first was on kind of the 101 and the basics of FSMA, and then the second one was on the first part of the obligations that fully covered farms need to adhere to, and then we will finish covering the rest of the details today. Also, under this program, we are excited to be publicly releasing a set of 8 fact sheets pretty soon that will be freely available on CAFF's website and our partners' websites. And then also there will be hard copies, we're hoping, at the EcoFarm conference in a few weeks here. So we're excited to get those out. Those give a little bit more in-depth, like they dive into, okay, soil amendments, and there's just a fact sheet all on soil amendments and what you need to do for FSMA and for NOP to be in compliance with regulations. Okay. Now, if this is the first webinar you've been on this topic, I think you can still stay on and get a lot out of the rest of this, but you should know that what we're talking about today is only for farms that are considered fully subject to FSMA. And some farms are not. They have different levels of exemptions. But fully subject farms are those that gross over $500,000 in sales, which is adjusted into $2011 dollars, and farms that sell less than $500,000 in average adjusted gross sales, but they don't sell at least 50% to a qualified end user. So I'm going to go pretty quickly over this. I know there's a lot of terms there, but I can talk more about those if there's a high number of attendees that are confused about that. And I recommend you just check out the earlier webinars on that, because we go into what these details mean and really break it down. Okay, here's a little overview. We, in the second webinar, covered the topics in brown, and then today, in this last webinar, we will cover the topics in orange. So we'll start out with the biological amendments of animal origin, and then Joanne is going to talk a lot about different natural resources, domesticated and wild animals details. And then we'll circle back to water at the end. And then just to recap, because there have been a little bit of changes since our last webinar on these compliance dates, or just this chart in general. So the biggest farms' FSMA compliance starts in just a couple of weeks here at the end of January. However, the FDA announced that for all states, inspections have been pushed back a year. So even if the biggest farms have to be in compliance this year, FDA is not going to start inspections in any state until 2019. So that is a recent announcement. And then also the water compliance deadline was proposed to be extended another year in addition to the extension that was already put on it. So that's why we have the new timeline for water compliance dates here, but it has this asterisk that it depends on future FDA decisions because that hasn't been finalized yet.
them if there's an outbreak there.
However, while compliance dates for biggest farms start pretty soon, that doesn't, inspections start next year, that doesn't mean you can't, you are still subject to FSMA. You should still do everything and get ready and be prepared and be all good to go, even though you won't be inspected potentially until next year. They're firm that the compliance deadlines haven't changed, so still abide by and get ready for the law according to this first column of compliance dates.
If there were an outbreak.
And also, if your farm is linked to an outbreak, some farms have exemptions from FSMA, and if your farm is linked to an outbreak, your exemption can be pulled, and you can become a farm that's fully subject to all of FSMA. And then just a quick note here, importantly, in the creation of FSMA, it was formally documented that FSMA does not require covered farms or fully subject farms to take measures to exclude animals from outdoor growing areas or to destroy animal habitat or otherwise clear farm borders around outdoor growing areas or drainages. And I know Joanne will mention this later in her discussion about the different ways that it's documented how FSMA cannot supersede organic regulations, how they have to work in conjunction with each other, and you are not going to do anything in the name of food safety that would go against what you're required to do for organics. You have to still fully abide by organics, and you can abide by both and do them in harmony together. Okay, so biological amendments of animal origin. In this topic, as you might imagine, there's a lot of details here, and I'm going to try to keep this understandable little nugget of information, and then I encourage those of you who want to know more after this webinar to dive into future resources, the fact sheet we're going to put out soon, and other resources available. In FSMA, biological soil amendments of animal origin are classified broadly into two main categories. Those that are considered treated by the law, or the law considers some amendments treated and some amendments untreated. And this is important because there are different categories as far as when and how you can apply treated versus untreated amendments. In general, the thought process is that the untreated amendments have a higher likelihood to transfer pathogens to produce if they're not applied properly. And then also the law mentions that human waste is not allowed unless it meets EPA regulations for biosolids. And this is a FSMA detail here, but under organic organic regulations, human waste is not allowed. So if you're an organic farm, the human waste part of FSMA doesn't even apply to you. And then another just thing to bring up here is that FSMA refers to soil amendments as biological soil amendments of animal origin. And these examples would be compost, one that's manure-based, bone meal, blood meal, feather meal. You guys get the picture, I'm sure, just animal-based, different amendments that farmers use. Okay, so I realize there's a lot going on this page, and I don't expect you and don't want you to try and read through this flow chart here on the slide, but this is part of the fact sheet I mentioned, and we have a bigger version of this on the fact sheet and a more explanation as to what's happening. But essentially, you have to figure out how every soil amendment that you use that's animal-based, how you can use it under FSMA. So, for example, I'm going to go to the next slide here because it breaks it down a little bit better. Basically, amendments fall into 4 different categories. The highest rating amendments are those that are considered treated, and you can apply this amendment to your crops in any manner up to harvest, so 0 days before harvest. Some amendments are considered treated, but they don't pass certain microbiological tests, so they have to be applied in a way that minimizes the potential for contact with covered produce. I have put some of these phrases in orange here because there are very minute differences between these different rating categories, and it's easy to miss like what's different between these categories when you first look at them. And then in medium rating, these are amendments that are considered untreated, and you have to apply it in a way that doesn't contact the produce. And then finally, there's this reserve category of amendments that when the law was being written, it became clear that there was not enough science-based research and evidence to determine how long like a raw manure has to be applied before harvest for that to be safe for food safety. Even though the National Organic Program had already established the 90 and 120-day rule, FSMA did not adopt that at this point in time, and so they're doing more research to see what kind of timeline they're going to put here in the end. Excuse me.
Yeah, at first they proposed a year, and then the organic farmers said, no, a year isn't going to work for us. And so then they proposed 9 months, and people said 9 months isn't going to work for us. So then they decided, okay, we'll do research and figure out what the exact amount of days. They basically said that the NOP 90 and 120-day rule was not based on pathogen survival. And so therefore they wanted to investigate that. Are you going to give some examples of these different?
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. So another component to consider for soil amendments is that if you're making, let's go back actually. So on here, the very first question is, did you buy the product? If you and the answer is no, we made it on farm, you have to use the static composting or turn composting requirements for time, temperature, and turning. And then you have to make sure you keep a documentation of them, and that would allow you to apply them in the highest rating manner. However, for the vast majority of soil amendments of animal origin, I imagine many farms are buying them. So if that's the case, you would have to get the certificate of conformance from the supplier. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And then figure out which criteria the supplier meets to be able to know how you could apply it.
You want to cut it up?
Okay. So that gets us to this slide on the requirements for purchase amendments. You might be wondering what needs to be on the certificate of conformance. Right here, here's the information. What I've been finding or hearing initially is that the manufacturer of these amendments has all this information available, but there seems to be a missing link in the supply chain, and a lot of the suppliers that are selling these products directly to farmers are losing this certificate along the way. So this will be something that we'll have to work with suppliers and different middlemen that are selling these products to farmers to make sure that they keep this written documentation with the product. Okay, so I realized that was a lot that was covered there. I don't know, Megan, if we have any questions to clarify certain concepts that were just mentioned.
I would think maybe give some examples of the highest, high, medium. What would like tell us?
So we haven't had any questions come in yet. If you do have questions, feel free to send those in. And also, while we're waiting for questions, just to let you know kind of who's in the audience today. We have people calling in from a number of spots in California, Gonzales, Watsonville, and Grand, and also people calling in from Oregon, Charlotte, North Carolina, even have a caller calling in from Mexico, so nice diversity of people calling in from different geographic regions. And also, there's a lot of people that have watched both installments of the series, and some people, this is also their first webinar. And a lot of people watch the recordings, which is good to hear.
Great, thanks, Megan.
So we did have a question come in that asked, what is treated versus untreated?
So that's a good question. Here on this, I just want flip back to this flowchart image to be able to show that. So treated is products that would fit into this highest or high rating category. So if you, for example, make compost on your farm and you follow the static composting requirements that were on the slide, the next slide, about the number of days and the temperature, and you kept documentation of that, so you had records, so you have your records to document, you would say yes, and that product is considered treated because you made the compost on farm in a concentrated and verified way that science has shown if you make compost this way, you are making safe compost. That would be considered a treated product. Say you buy, and another example, say you buy some fish emulsion and you can't get a certificate of conformance from your supplier. They say, we don't have one. And you try and there's nothing available. So you would have to say no because you don't have a COC that has these testing records on it. And then you don't have a COC that states some other scientifically valid process was used. And you don't have a COC that states that salmonella and fecal coliforms was tested for. So you would go down this flow chart and figure out the difference. Essentially, if you don't have a product that has followed the static composting or turn composting requirements, or has been tested and has a certificate that's documenting it, then it becomes an untreated product. I guess I'll probably stop there because I know we need to continue, but we can talk about this more at the end in the question and answer session.
So I think pelletized chicken manure would be considered the highest rating because you know, it goes through this heat process that kills everything. We don't have a list here of everything and you know where they would fall, but basically you know you'd have to assess each one, and certainly if you're buying it, you need this certificate of compliance.
All right, thanks. That's helpful. And then we did have someone also write in wondering, you just gave an example of the highest rating. What would be an example of a high rating and a medium rating product?
Of the high rating.
Yeah, so if we just go back to this chart, this is all like pretty very minorly different, and this chart was pulled directly from the law. So if you have a COC that has it tested and has no detectable Listeria, Salmonella, or E. coli, that would give you the highest rating. Some products are not tested for those microbiome, for those pathogens, and so you might not be able to get that test, but maybe your product was tested down here for the Salmonella and fecal coliforms, so you have written documentation that it has those testing. And so that product would be a high rating. But yeah, sorry, it's not as simple at this point in time of just saying like all fish emulsion is a high rating or all liquid kelp is a highest rating. There's not at this point in time that I'm aware of a universal byproduct classification. But we can work on it.
That's good. So thanks, that was helpful. And I just had one quick clarifying question before we move on to the next presentation. Someone was wondering if compost made from animal products can be be considered treated? And I think you already answered that when you said like pelletized chicken manure is the highest rating, so that would be a treated product.
Yes, you can make compost with animal inputs as long as you follow, again, the static or the turn composting requirements and keep documentation of that.
And that would be
Okay,
hot.
great.
And then it would be a high category product. But I'll turn it over to Joanne. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kaylee. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so my part of the talk is going to be covering food safety and conservation. And this farm illustration you see, we're going to be talking about different parts of it, and you can obtain that. I'll talk about that later. So we're going to cover the context in which good and bad microbes operate. I'm going to give an overview of the NOP and FDA regulations as it relates to co-managing food safety and conservation, and how NOP and FDA regulations are applied using a multiple barrier approach that reduces contamination. So there's biotic, live, and abiotic conditions that influence pathogen reduction. For biotic factors, especially in the soil, but also in water and on plant surfaces, there's microbial interactions. And in healthy soils on organic farms, there's lots of microbes living in the soil, and they compete with, predate upon, and are antagonistic to foodborne pathogens. But not all biotic factors are good. There are some harborage going on, biofilms, which you might think of as kind of like the slime on things, although you don't necessarily see it. It's bacterial communities that hold moisture and can harbor salmonella and or other kinds of microbes. Amoebas will eat bacteria and other pathogens, and they don't necessarily kill them. And these pathogens can be in algae. So having a pond like you see there is not a good thing. It's much better to have clear water, and it wouldn't be supporting those pathogens. Sunlight is amazing for a multitude of reasons. We wouldn't be here without the sun, but it helps to desiccate pathogens, and the UV radiation kills pathogens. That can happen on the surface of soils. Again, it can happen in water, shallow water, and on plants. So pathogens like the same kind of factors pretty much that plants like. So they don't like a lot of salt in soils. They like average pH 6 or 7. They like nutrients. They do better with nitrogen and carbon. They like temperatures that plants like, but they can survive in freezing temperatures. Usually the only way that a freeze will kill them is if there's a freeze-thaw kind of cycling that can get rid of pathogens. But there's pathogens in frozen ground that was deposited years and years ago. They like moisture. They like microscopic niches, like clay particles have lots of little sites for microbes to exist. All kinds of microbes, good and bad. So as Dave said, and Kaylee, we're talking about how pathogens persist in the soil, and we did a lot of analysis on this and shared that with FDA too, encouraging them to really figure out what is going on with pathogen persistence, because as you can see here, there are some pathogens like salmonella that might only exist 7 days in some soils, and others almost a year. So we really need to know more about what are the factors involved. And some of those abiotic conditions I mentioned, like the clay content and the salinity content, the nutrient content, help to determine that. So there's all kinds of conservation practices that help to reduce pathogens. Like I've been talking about soil microbial biodiversity, but there's also conservation practices that address water movement and pathogen movement through water, vegetative conservation practices that help, and animal management practices that help. All of these conservation practices in the dark blue boxes specifically help with food safety. Grass waterways, riparian buffers and wetlands are helping to filter pathogens in water. Compost and cover crops build that soil microbiological diversity. Windbreaks and hedgerows can intercept pathogens blowing in the air. These same cover crops and grass waterways and windbreaks and so forth do so much for us, for our food and for the environment, as you can see here, from nutrient cycling and water holding capacity to groundwater recharge and pollination, pest control services. So bacteria, there's a lot of bacteria in us, and there's so much that it would fill this half-gallon jug. So there's lots of really good bacteria out there in the world. What's interesting is those bacteria are tiny compared to the human cells, so there's 10 times more of them in us than us, which is amazing to think about. So it's a web of life, and they are part of it, and it's not all bad. Obviously, we're talking about the bad ones today. So how, we've heard that produce can make people sick. And in fact, a few years ago, the CDC published this report that said 46% of illnesses are attributed to produce. And when I first heard that, I was like, oh no, poor farmers, this is terrible. But then as you break that down and really understand what that means, contamination could come from the farm, but it could be that there was contamination during processing or storage or shipping, or somebody sneezed on something in the store, or your partner just prepared a chicken on the cutting board and you didn't know it, and now you're cutting this tomato. So there's all kinds of ways that they came up with that number. And then specifically CDC, they're always trying to figure out, when a couple people, at least a couple people get sick, they start to track where that illness came from. And only 40% of the time can they actually figure out the causes. So 60% of the time they don't know. But of the 40%, they said between 98 and 2008, 5% might come from the farm. Between 2009 and 2010, it was less than 1%. Now, as they get better at figuring out what's going on, these numbers could change dramatically. As we know, from 40% to 90% of the causes, they could change. But from this data, it looks like the cause of illness isn't mainly coming from the farm. But that's not to say that farmers shouldn't worry about it. They do have to comply with FDA regulations, just as they have to comply with NOP regulations if they want to be organic. Some crops are riskier than others, and foods. If you're eating raw food, it's riskier than cooked. Fresh cut, ready to eat, leafy greens are riskier. So is netted melons. They can have all those little spaces for microbes to exist. And tomatoes, because of that top piece where the stem scar is, can harbor pathogens. We worked with the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. CAFF and Wild Farm Alliance are members, and so are like 90-something other groups across the country. We work to help first educate Congress that food safety and conservation can go together, and all kinds of sustainable practices for that matter. And so Congress responded, and they said FDA should not, when they write their rules, they should not conflict with organic regulations. They also said those rules should, or FDA should consider environmental mandates and talk with conservation organizations, which they did. They worked with USDA and NRCS as they were trying to figure out how to write rules. So the NOP regulation says farmers must conserve biodiversity, maintain or improve natural resources, including soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. And FDA says they listened, and they said their regulations say, as you heard earlier, that you can grow crops in diverse landscapes, and you don't have to exclude animals with fencing or destroy animal habitat. So that's a really good thing. FDA also does not authorize the harming or killing of protected species like this red-legged frog. The reason why we are focusing so much on conservation is because in 2006, a spinach contamination occurred in the Salinas Valley where several people died, and the produce industry realized that they may lose their business if they continued to happen. It was a really big hit on the spinach industry. And so they started saying to farmers, we're not going to take anything close to wildlife habitat. And this is an example of a mile of riparian habitat along the Salinas River was taken down because of food safety issues, misguided food safety issues. In 2007, 89% of the growers that were surveyed in California's Central Coast that manage 140,000 acres said they'd actively discourage or eliminate wildlife from cropping areas. So it was starting to get become a really big deal. A few years later, the Nature Conservancy did a study where they said over a 5-year period, about 13% of the remaining riparian habitat in the region had been eliminated or degraded. So FDA says you can have animals around, and they say if you have domesticated animals that you must develop a system that adequately controls their excreta and litter, and yeah, and so you can have these working animals around, and not just livestock for production value. USDA says whatever USDA Organic says, whatever practices you put in place that complies with the regulation, you must monitor those practices to make sure they're performing as you say you're doing. USDA also, or NOP, I should say, also says that there are livestock healthcare practices must include sanitation so that there's not a spread of disease, and management of manure so that it's not contributing to contamination of crops by pathogenic organisms. I think a lot of people don't realize these regulations are there so much, and they're really important, and it's really great that the NOP was so forward thinking about that. The NOP also says that producers must manage manure that doesn't contribute to the contamination of crops and soil, and they must manage pastures in a way that other outdoor access in a way that doesn't put soil and water at risk. So they say it in a bunch of different ways. Basically, don't be spreading pathogens. So what does FDA say? Well, they say, okay, you don't have to take out habitat or fence out wildlife, but you have to monitor, just like NOP says you have to monitor. Growers have to visually make an assessment if there's significant evidence of contamination by animals. It could be grazing or working animals or wild or domesticated animals from livestock and working animals to cats and dogs. And anyways, once that monitoring must occur during harvest and right before harvest. And significant contamination they're talking about is significant damage, especially like eating the crop, or feces are left on the crop or near the crop, and trampling. And if there's a significant number of animals that continually come into the crop, then producer has to do something about that. But they also, in their preamble to the rule, they have some really good language. A preamble, every regulation that's written by an agency has the rules, but there's a preamble that tells people what were they thinking. And here they say, we encourage the application of practices that can enhance food safety and that are also consistent with sustainable conservation. We continue to encourage the co-management of food safety, conservation, and environmental protection. And these here and other wording are what organic farmers need to pull out when they talk to their buyers. If their buyers come to the farm and say, hey, we don't like that habitat, get rid of it, you can tell them, look, FDA does not say that, you know, this is not in line with what they require. So I just skipped this quickly. Pathogens, how do they get on the farm? Where they come in, by wind or water, animals, people. Here's some cases of airborne contamination from CAFF, from Ohio Fairgrounds and fields. Basically, pathogens can adhere to dust and blow across the landscape and contaminate crops. This is recorded outbreaks associated with irrigation water. Now, the outbreaks are actually where illnesses are recorded, and they trace back not just at what farm it came from, but you know, where on the farm. Like, was it a pond, or was it the well water that was accidentally mixed with dairy manure? What are the prevalence of pathogens in animals? Well, domestic animals depends on who they are. There's widespread E. coli 0157 in cattle, and it's higher in cattle that are in CAFOs than those that are on pasture. But pigs and dogs and poultry, and especially younger animals, will carry higher levels than adults. Salmonella, poultry are known for that more so, and pigs, but cattle and other livestock can carry that. These are some other bacteria and other kinds of pathogens, and you can see it's kind of all across the board. Our livestock can carry these. Associated outbreaks related to wildlife. So that's where, like, this top line shows spinach, the E. coli 0157 it was the same DNA fingerprint that made those people sick and die that were found in non-native feral pigs in California. And what's interesting, though, is not everybody agrees. Everybody agrees that it was found in feral pigs, but it was also found in some nearby cattle, and it was also found in the water. And so the researchers don't all agree on how that spinach got contaminated, but they do agree that there was a lot of E. coli in that area. There are some situations that are more risky than others. So like this picture with blackbirds and the cattle. Remember, the cattle carry lots of E. coli 0157, H7. And so it's not a good thing to then have those blackbirds come over to your farm. You wouldn't want to attract them, but there's other issues too. You can see dumps and compost piles. Oops. So E. coli 0157 H7 prevalence in mammals and birds, usually it's low, 0 to 2% on lots of wildlife populations. It really depends, though. There are some, like feral pigs, that they eat other animals species, and sometimes crows do too, and so they can have higher incidences. And then these birds that are associated with cattle can also have higher incidences. You can see that for the most part, deer have low incidence. Now, when we look at salmonella, there's one study where there was 7% of the numbers had salmonella, but it turns out that they were associated with sheep on the same range that had the same level of salmonella. So it depends on where these animals are or who they are. Like pigs, again, they have lots of salmonella potentially, and it's just because they like to eat everything. Then amphibians and reptiles, they carry pathogens. They carry lots of salmonella, but it turns out that they're not all that salmonella probably makes us sick. There's some, I think like 20-something% of the salmonella that we know that these animals carry do make us sick, but the rest of it we've never tested. So just to be on the safe side, we say, yeah, they could be carriers. But again, I would imagine a lot of it has to do with where they are, what kind of landscape they're living in, if they're carrying the pathogens that make us sick. Some more Campylobacter and Cryptosporidium. See, there's feral pig again. This is actually, you can't exactly tell, but this is showing two different pathogens. Over on the right bottom, you see those stars, and that means Cryptosporidium. And so you can see feral pigs that show up here again. And so really, if all the animals out there, you really want to make sure that feral pigs are not coming into your farm. But other animals, basically any kind of feces, you need to make sure that isn't contaminating the crop, as I mentioned earlier. What's interesting, though, is that biodiversity loss increases pathogen prevalence. At least in this preliminary study, they showed how when biodiversity was present, and there was lots of different rodent species, they don't sleep together, they don't share food together, and they don't share pathogens. So those rodents all have low levels of pathogens. Whereas when there wasn't biodiversity, it's a pretty stark landscape, but deer mice can survive and thrive in that situation, and their populations grow. They don't have any competitors. They share food, they sleep together, and they share pathogens, and their pathogen levels are really high. And this is found not just in foodborne pathogens, but like in hantavirus and Lyme disease, they've seen the same kinds of relationships with biodiversity. Not to say that it's always the case, but in general. A couple of years ago now, a comprehensive study was done looking at data that's been collected since that spinach contamination in 2006, and lots of data has been collected. And basically, they have these conclusions. The absence of natural vegetation did not contribute to pathogen reduction, and cleared land resulted in increased pathogen prevalence over time. So I mentioned I wanted to go over this multi-barrier approach to minimizing food safety. And there's four different parts to it. Keeping pathogens from entering the farm. Once the pathogens are there, how do you make sure that they're not contaminating the crops? Whether it's something non-livestock related, or number 3, if it's coming from livestock, make sure it's not contaminating the crops. And then keep pathogens from moving out from the farm into the wider landscape if they are already there. So having neighbors like this is a problem if you're going to grow spinach right next door. What FDA says is that farmers have to make an operational assessment to identify farm risks like this. So NOP says that if you're growing a crop like a perennial crop, any kind of perennial crop, you need to have some kind of biodiversity there, and it could be hedgerows, it could be a windbreak, and both of those conservation practices will intercept dust, pathogen-laden dust, which is a good thing. So, and it helps to address FDA's concerns. There's, as I mentioned, water can bring in pathogens, and this chart shows all kinds of ways that water can be contaminated directly from livestock and wildlife leaving their feces right in the water, but it might come from runoff from where they are in the landscape, which then might go directly into the water. It might infiltrate into subsurface flow, then get into the water. There's also human sewage that could be contaminants. As I mentioned, pathogens can adhere to algae and detritus. They can adhere to soils and sediments. So it's really the best thing is to keep your animals healthy as much as you can and be cognizant of how water can be impacted. So here's an example of what you don't want to see if you're going to be irrigating from this water. And animals, like this many animals on a hillside right above where a crop is grown could be a problem. One of the conservation practices that could be used, this is called a diversion ditch, where it intercepts the water that's coming off of a slope and takes it away from the crop. Wetlands can also help to filter pathogens. They actually, lots of cool studies that show how they do that. And it turns out the NOP requires that if there's a wetland on a farm, that it is maintained and or improved. FDA, you know, you have to make sure you know do this operational assessment to know what's coming into the farm, and having runaway livestock and or a pack of dogs is not a good thing. But they say, you know, if that continually is happening, you need to have a system that adequately controls that. And it's harder sometimes to keep out wildlife. And so then again, there has to be a way to make sure that that crop isn't getting contaminated by monitoring during the crop's growth and afterwards, and right before harvest. So the second barrier is once that, like if you know there's an area that's continually contaminated or other contamination areas on your farm, you want to think about where to situate crops, that especially crops that are grown raw, that are part of this food safety or FSMA produce rules. So avoiding flooded land is a good thing. If you can't do that, it's a good idea to institute a waiting period after flooding before replanting, and FDA says that you shouldn't harvest and sell anything that is reasonably likely to be contaminated. So avoiding other types of contamination, areas where the contamination is higher, be good. In those situations, maybe it would be better to grow livestock feed or put pastures in there. Also, you wouldn't want to grow some spinach underneath those birds on that telephone pole, especially if they just came from a livestock operation. But there's other things like hanging branches, and the picture in the middle is interesting. This is you can't exactly see it, but there's crows sitting on irrigation sprinkler heads. And there's no, this is the Salinas Valley, they've taken out a lot of the habitat, as you just heard, and there's not a lot of places for them to roost. So they're roosting on the irrigation pipe, which is really not a good situation. It's also not really smart to plant in a wildlife corridor. NOP requires that operators maintain or improve wildlife, so keeping those corridors open is a good thing, and also then they won't stray and come into the crop and contaminate it. So this monitoring, as I mentioned already, you're probably gonna, if anything, I hope what you leave with is that crops have to be monitored for significant animal signs during the growing season and right before harvest. So once contamination is found, some growers will establish a no harvest buffer around that contamination, but they wouldn't have to. They could take, excuse me, take that contaminated part of the crop out and dispose of it properly. The key is to not harvest anything that's contaminated and make sure that you know later when the harvest is happening where that was, if you don't remove it right then and there. So remember, FDA said we encourage the application of practices that enhance food safety that are consistent with sustainable conservation. Well, encouraging raptors is a good thing. They help keep down rodent populations, which can carry pathogens. And by encouraging raptors, you're also complying with NOP to maintain wildlife and improve their condition. Sometimes fencing has to be used. Remember, FDA said they do not require fencing, but obviously, if the crop's getting eaten and you're losing money, you need to fence. Sometimes farmers use homemade kind of fencing, like this double electric deer fencing. They can, below that on the left, they could use this plastic fencing. Ground squirrels don't like to go where they can't see over, so that may deter them. I'm not sure about rabbits, but over in the top right, electric pig fencing can work. You have to make sure that it's electrified always. But not, I mean, there are some people that spend lots of money putting up expensive pig fencing, which, you know, I'm sure you have to really think hard to make that cost effective in your whole scheme of your farm budget. Other kinds of ways that if you want to make sure that if there are rodents or any kind of animals coming onto your farm, you don't want to attract them and then have them moving out into your crop where they might contaminate. So removing coal piles is a good thing, and taking irrigation pipe off the ground so that rodents aren't in there living is also smart. I said this, I'll say it again, intercepting waterborne, windborne pathogens. There's these different conservation practices that really help to make the farm more food safe, more supportive of NOP regulations for supporting wildlife. One of the things that NOP says is organic operations must manage manure, other outdoor access areas in a manner that doesn't contribute to contamination of crop, soil, water. FDA says keep domestic animals out of water sources. So this is not a good thing. What you're seeing here, if this was an organic farm, any farm, especially organic farm, be bad news if you were irrigating out of that water or with that water. So NOP says that you have to manage your animal material. So this picture on the left is not very smart, putting out say that is manure and it's blowing onto your recently irrigated crop, there could be contamination there. Or if a manure has been applied recently and then the field is irrigated soon after, there could be runoff that, yeah, that's not a good thing. As you know, Kaylee already mentioned that there's a waiting period between applications of manure and the next harvest as a requirement by the NOP, and FDA just says, yeah, that's a good idea. They haven't come up with any exact regulations about that. Cover crops compost help to reduce soil pathogens because it's increasing soil microbial diversity. It's better to use treated compost as opposed to raw manure. Green waste can be used, but you have to be careful. Sometimes there, when people mow their lawns, there's dog feces on them. And so this is a third barrier, which is thinking about, okay, if there's livestock on the farm, how do you avoid contaminating a crop? So you don't want to feed livestock right next to a crop or have their watering trough or salt block right next to there. Again, you kind of saw this with when I was talking about neighboring issues, but this could be on your own farm where you have lots of animals above where the crop is growing. And that's a problem both for NOP and FDA says it's not a good situation. With livestock, I'm just showing you how yes, you can manage for healthy livestock in organic situations, but you have to be aware of sanitation issues and not contributing to contamination. More about these. This is on the left is a grass waterway. I don't think I've shown you that picture before. On the right is a filter strip. So those grasses they capture pathogens as water flows through them, and then as the water goes down, the sunlight helps to desiccate and the UV radiation to kill them. Guard animals can be used, as can weeder geese. There just has to be a system to make sure they're not going to be contaminating the crops. So can draft horses. Then the last barrier is preventing pathogens from leaving the farm. So placing manure and compost away from waterways is a good thing. Using vegetation like these grasses, but also these tall riparian trees help to intercept pathogens before they get into the waterways. And these practices also help to maintain wildlife. Sediment basins can be used, which captures runoff coming off of a farm so that it won't go into the natural waterway. And this is a couple of publications that we've put out. The one on the left, Farming with Food Safety and Conservation in Mind, and the one on the right, we worked with CAFF on both of these. The one on the right, we just updated, so please check it out. It's on our website and also CAFF's, and it has a bunch of the illustrations that I mentioned, including this one, and goes through all of the conservation practices that can help keep farms safe. And that's all I got. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Joanne, for a really thorough presentation on balancing food safety and conservation on farms. So if you have any questions for Joanne, we'll take a couple of questions now. And so feel free to write them in. While we're waiting for people to write in, we had a question that came in for Kaylee and Dave about the soil amendment. So why don't we address that now, and then we'll get back to questions for Joanne. So they were wondering whether OMRI or WUSDA has considered listing the inputs as having COCs available for them for soil amendments that are available for purchase. So Kaylee or Dave, if you have an answer to that, feel free to jump on.
That's a really good idea, and I haven't heard anything about it, but something we can look into. It would certainly be helpful if there was something like that available.
Great. And then we also had one other compost-related question. Are there disallowed composting methods that would still make the final product considered raw under FSMA?
Well, if you're not keeping records to prove that you've met the static composting or the turn composting methods, then time and temperature, even if you have been doing it, you don't have the records to prove you've done that. So based off of FSMA, that product would not be considered treated. So that would be one way that could happen if you don't have records to prove that you've been following the validated processes. I don't know if that answers what the person's looking for, but
It would still be considered raw.
it still would be considered raw compost, and that's that category of the soil amendments that FDA hasn't decided on yet. We don't know the raw, category, how many days the FDA is gonna require that to be applied before harvest. So for right now, it's suggested that everyone follows the National Organic Program 90-120 day rule for quote unquote raw categorized compost. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, great, thanks. And then Joanne, we had a question come in for you that is asking if there are suggested, what are the suggested management techniques to prevent algae bloom in ponds? Okay.
Well, algae bloom is happening because there's excess nutrients, and it depends on how long that has been, nutrients have been going into the pond, as to how easily that is dealt with. So if it's just been recent, just putting in a diversion ditch that takes nutrients, say, from cattle uphill, and diverting that could help. And or sometimes it's not just livestock, it could be runoff from the farm fields themselves. And so anyways, any kind of nutrients. And but if it's been happening for 50 or 100 years and that pond is just really full of nutrients, it's a harder thing to extract all those nutrients out. And it may be that pond is not the best source for irrigation in that case.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move on to the next section of the presentation, but if you still have questions for Joanne, feel free to send those in and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. So Joanne, thanks again, and Kaylee and Dave will move the presentation back over to you.
Great, thanks, Megan.
Okay, so we're going to talk about water. I think to summarize one part of Joanne's presentation, do not harvest anything that has feces on it. I was at one workshop and a farmer said, well, can I just brush this off or whatever? And the guy from the university just about had a heart attack. So No, the answer is no. You cannot brush it off. And every pasture should have a filter strip at the bottom of it. I think that's another conclusion. So agricultural water. Okay, there's a very specific definition of what agricultural water is in FSMA. It's water used in covered activities, and that means with crops that are covered by FSMA, on covered produce where water is intended to or is likely to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. Okay, and so it's not all water, but water that meets this very specific definition. And so this is what FDA is concerned with, and says that it must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. And adequate sanitary quality varies depending on what use you're going to put it under. How do we forward this?
So we have a couple examples, and because we're covering our lot today, we're going to just go through these on our end instead of having them be audience examples. But this is just to really drive home the point, like Dave said, not all water on your farm is necessarily considered agricultural water. So if you're watering lettuce on overhead irrigation, that is agricultural water because the water is going to directly touch a covered produce item, which is lettuce, and it's going to touch that crop. Whereas if you're watering oranges on drip irrigation, oranges are a covered crop under FSMA, but because it's not going to touch the water, is not going to touch the food contact surfaces of the oranges, then that is not, so that's not considered ag water. A different example, you might have some potatoes on overhead irrigation. These, this scenario, is not considered ag water because potatoes are a crop that's rarely consumed raw, and so it is not considered, it's not on the covered produce list of crops. And then one final example here is carrots on drip irrigation. So carrots are a crop that's considered a covered crop under FSMA, and this is considered agricultural water because that water is going to drip down and percolate through the soil and touch the carrot contact surface or the carrot. So I hope everyone's not thoroughly confused by just going over this. Essentially, not all your water on the farm is ag water, but if a farm is a diversified operation growing a variety of crops and irrigating them a variety of ways, it most likely makes sense for that farm to just look at all their water on the farm as assume that it's agricultural water, because otherwise it's going to probably be more of a headache to keep track of where you're testing water and where you're not testing water and the different details that we're about to go over. I just bring this up because there might be some farms that are literally just a potato farm that grows potatoes on overhead irrigation. They don't need to be concerned about anything with FSMA water because their farm's not subject to these FSMA regulations. So it's just some of the layers of technicality in all of this.
Okay, so what does FSMA require of you? And I remind you now that FDA has postponed your compliance with the water requirements until 2022 at the earliest. So that's 4 years away from now. Nevertheless, you know, people who haven't complied should, you know, start doing these things, right? Because food safety is not something that you do from one day to the next. It requires long-term implementation. So FSMA requires that you inspect all your water sources and distribution systems at least annually, and that the wells or ditches or anything that is related to the conveyance of the water has to be free of trash, debris, domesticated animals, and other hazards. So one of the recommendations is that you map the farm's water systems. That's always a good idea, and in the NOP you're required to have a farm map, and so mapping the water systems would be a good complement to that. FSMA divides the water into basically production water, and then harvest and post-harvest water. And the standards for harvest and post-harvest water are higher than what they are for production water. And this is because in production, obviously, pathogens will die off, but in the harvest and post-harvest, there's a very limited amount of time for die-off, and so they want the water to be essentially clean. So production water are all the things you see on the left side there, including any kind of water used to spray things, which people often ignore, as well as frost protection or dust abatement. And the harvest and post-harvest obviously includes hand washing water. So there's two kinds of water in FSMA, surface water and groundwater. Groundwater consists simply of properly capped wells. So if you had an open well, and there was an example of this down in Baja, California, where there was an open well and some salamanders or something had crawled into this and was living down there and contaminated it with salmonella. So that wouldn't qualify as a properly capped well, and it would come under surface water. And so any kind of ditch, any kind of river or stream, spring, pond, reservoir, all this is considered surface water. So what we're going to say here is essentially what was proposed by FDA, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. Like how long you have to wait after you apply manure, FDA doesn't know, they're doing research. Same thing applies here. There's a whole set of detailed water testing requirements that FDA put forward. Now it's uncertain which of those will survive and which will be changed over the next 4 years. So, but this is what is essentially proposed, right? That you have to develop a baseline. And for a surface water source, you would have to take 20 water tests in order to establish this baseline. And after the baseline is established, you'd have to do 5 tests annually. So they're essentially assuming that you do 4 years of 5 tests and then keep doing 5 tests per year. For groundwater, your baseline would consist of 4 tests in 1 year, and then afterwards just 1 test per year. On the other hand, the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement has been testing well water for years and has found it basically not to produce anything interesting. Once you establish that the well is not contaminated, it's not contaminated. But anyway, this is the proposal as it currently exists. So you want to go on with this?
Thanks, Dave. So in September, the FDA did announce some water updates. They proposed to extend the already extended timeline another year. So here we have the extended timeline for water, depending upon the size of farm. And why the extension? As we mentioned, they're still trying to address questions about practical implementation and reducing the regulatory burden. So you might be wondering, well, what do I do now? All this water stuff seems like it's up in the air. Well, we would recommend that, as Dave mentioned, if you don't have a map of your irrigation system, create one and then make sure to visually inspect it and determine if you see any risks. So maybe you realize that you have some poultry that are kind of close to where your ditch water is, and you could easily move them downstream so that the water goes first to your crops and then it later goes to where the chickens are. So just simple things like that can really do a lot for reducing your risks. Again, if you haven't done any water testing, that would be a great place to start. Wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go jump on board and do 20 water tests for each of your surface water sources immediately, because that might change. It is more reasonable to do a few tests and establish some of your water quality profile information so you get a better sense of how the quality of your water is. If you're doing testing already, I'd recommend just keep doing what you're doing. And if you're wondering, I've never done a water test, what do I test for? In the way FSMA is currently structured, you would want to get a quantified generic E. coli test. So that would spit out a number to you, a number per 100 milliliters of however many generic E. coli are there. This is a wordy slide, but it's basically just to let you know that there used to be a very restricted number of methods that labs could use to test your water. And recently, this past fall, this list was expanded, and now more methodologies are allowed under FSMA. This MPN methods group, the most probable number methods, that's a testing method that many labs are already using. So this was a good thing for farmers. This expanded the allowable testing options. If you're getting tested, make sure they're using one of these methods, and this wider testing allowable range does give you access to cheaper testing than the test that was allowed before. And then just to touch on post-harvest water requirements, as Dave mentioned, this water has stricter standards. This is water that is used in the various ways that are listed here. And if you are not using municipal water, you would need to make sure you had a generic E. coli test that had a 0 result for that water. Since the product is so close to going to the end consumer and there's not a lot of time for die-off, there's serious likelihood that if the water is contaminated, somebody might get sick from eating that product. So there's a 0 test result required here. And then just I think this is the last slide. Also in the post-harvest arena for FSMA regulations, you need to consider what type of equipment you're using and how and when you're cleaning it and maintaining it. And then FSMA does have some language here that says when necessary and appropriate to sanitize all food contact surfaces. So this is just something that's important to consider, especially for organic farmers, because there are various types of sanitizer products, and some of them are not allowed under National Organic Program regulations and some are. So if farmers are going to use sanitizers on equipment, they need to make sure they're using ones that are allowed under NOP. And then lastly, here's a link at the bottom of this slide, and these slides PDF will be sent to you all, but there have been some water roundtable discussions on this because this is a very complicated and yeah, a topic that needs a lot more work for the requirement for the regulations. And in February, there'll be another meeting, but in October, they were working on some options for resolving some of these water issues with the regulations, and they're trying to approve alternatives and potentially replace the quantitative requirements, such as having to get 20 water tests or 5 water tests with qualitative standards. And they're also looking at current private industry water quality standards to see and just really gather research so that whatever the final regulations require is science-based. So that was a whirlwind, I realize, but water is really a work in progress still. So we didn't want to spend too much time getting into the nitty-gritty on water because these numbers of tests and types of tests might change. So that's just an overview. And if you want to dive deeper, I recommend there's Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings that go into this more in depth, and you could reach out to myself and others. I'm happy to talk more in depth about this if you'd like.
Great, thank you very much for that overview. And we've had a couple of questions come in. One was wondering how a rice crop is categorized. And the person that wrote in said that anywhere from 5 to 8 tons an acre of raw manure is used in the spring. And then organic growers will drain water for weed management during the season, putting the manure-laden water into the surface water systems, which is usually picked up downstream by other farms. The water doesn't touch the edible portion of the crop, so is rice exempt?
Well, the first component to look at for that question is rice considered a covered crop under FSMA? And excuse me, it's part of the grain. You know, it's a grain, and grains are not under FSMA. So the rice wouldn't be, but I don't know with the other comment in that question about explaining how the water is going to go down and be used by other people. That's definitely something for people to consider. If you're not the end user of the water, think about how your uses might impact others. If there's ways you could eliminate contamination or reduce contamination for the next person who gets the water.
Great, thank you. And then there was another question wondering whether the labs that you send water samples to, do they have to have any baseline qualifications?
They have to be a certified lab. I don't have like the name of the exact certification off the top of my head. I don't know, Jacob, if you have any knowledge on this.
I know for our third-party food safety standards, they have to be ISO 17025 accredited.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to open up to questions for all speakers. So if there's any other questions for Joanne, feel free to write those in. And we did have a question come in for you, Jacob. Someone was wondering whether if CCOF inspectors be monitoring to FSMA standards for, or just to the NOP.
And yeah, just to follow up on the accreditation for the water testing labs for FSMA, that I'm not sure of off the top of my head. So we'd have to look and get back to people about that. FDA, the way they structured their rule is significantly different than the way the organic rule is, where in the organic rule, the USDA accredits or deputizes third-party certification bodies to go out and be the boots on the ground, verifying compliance for organic regulations. FDA, on the other hand, has decided to work with their partners in the state departments of ag to hire and train auditors and inspectors to do the FSMA compliance work. So currently, CCOF or other organic certification bodies, or even food safety certification bodies, cannot do a FSMA compliance audit. So we do audits to other food safety standards that help with that FSMA, and you could talk to me about that offline, but currently we will not do FDA FSMA audits.
All right, great, thanks for that clarification. And there is another question came in wondering whether compost tea is considered a manure product. And I'm assuming with that question that there's being manure added to the compost tea. So Kaylee and Dave, do you have any insight on that?
Well, compost tea is Jacob actually has some pretty thorough experience looking into this for FSMA. Sorry to put you on the spot, but.
No, it's okay. It's a tricky one. I mean, FDA considers, biological amendments of animal origin to be considered soil amendments. And so then they lump that into whether they're treated or whether they're not treated, and based on like composting processes. So when you make a tea from compost, you can decide whether or not you want to test it and have it be, to try to get that high rating of a treated biological soil amendment of animal origin. It depends on really your processes. And we have a question into the FDA's Technical Assistance Network. We haven't heard back yet. And I think FDA is really trying to figure out where compost tea, how it fits into the general scheme of things with the produce safety rule. But for now, it's treated like, like a manure. And if you can prove that it doesn't have Listeria, Salmonella, and E. coli, then you can apply it in that high manner, like where maybe say treated chicken pelletized manures can be that way. But most compost tea folks aren't going to have it tested or aren't going to go to those extremes to get it tested for listeria. So you have to apply it in a manner consistent with the non-treated aspects of the rule.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Nice. So I just wanted to be mindful of time. It's about 1:30 right now, and we're going to go a couple minutes over, but I wanted to let everybody know that we will be sending out a recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint slides, so if you need to jump off now, you can watch the end on the recording. And we have one more question for Joanne. And we had a webinar participant who'd like to use grazing animals in their crop rotations and wanted some advice on how to do that while complying with FSMA and organic regulations.
Yeah, let's see. That can happen. Actually, I'm wondering if this should be a question answered by Dave and Kaylee because it's about manure. I think, well, Kaylee, what do you think about it?
Sure, yeah. So this is also another question that FDA hasn't clarified, because the application of animal manure, like from animals just on pasture, and then you maybe use those fields the next year or 8 months later and till them in and plant crops on them. They have said previously that the animal depositing feces while on pasture is different than an application of, a manure spreader spreading tons and tons of manure at the start of field prep. So at this point, I would say, from what we know from FDA, I would take records of when you're going to have the animals grazing in an area, take record of the last day they were on that ground, and then the first day that you start harvesting from that ground, and follow the NOP on the different processes you should do there.
All right, great, thank you. So I think we're going to wrap things up for now. Again, if we didn't get to a specific question, or you think of something later on that you'd like some guidance on, feel free to contact our presenters, and we'll send out their contact information along with the recording of the webinar and the PDF of the PowerPoint slides. So thanks again to Dave, Kaylee, and Joanne for taking time to be with us today. I know they all have a lot going on, and Jacob as well. So thanks for sharing your expertise with us. And I just wanted to go through a few additional resources. As we've mentioned earlier in the presentation, CAFF, Wild Farm Alliance, and CCOF all have great resources on their website on food safety. If you are looking for the actual text of FSMA, there's a link there. And also the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition has a really good flow chart to help people understand where they fall in FSMA compliance. So if any of the growers that you work with are kind of confused, that's a good resource to use. And there's also the links to the past webinars that we've had in the series, and we'll send those out in the email as well with follow-up. And we have some upcoming events. As I mentioned before, we'll be having a How Do I Need to Comply with FSMA webinar for growers on January 22nd, and that will be similar to the FSMA 101 webinar that we had for ag professionals last year, so you can check that out. We're also going to be holding, if farms that have to fully comply with FSMA may need to take a required training course. One of their supervisors has to attend one of these trainings. So the CCOF Foundation will be holding a number of those in 2018. The first one will be at March in the Fresno region. It'll be offered in both English and Spanish. And then we'll be at various other locations throughout California this year and the beginning of next year. And if you're in Sacramento in February, it's the CCOF Annual Meeting and Conference, and this year's theme is Organic Hotspots. So thanks again. We enjoyed having you with us this afternoon, and please fill out your evaluation form. If you would like to receive continuing education units, please include your full name and your Certified Crop Advisor certification number if you're a CCA. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.